Most people who were raised Catholic could describe purgatory without hesitation. It is the place where you go after death to be punished for your sins before you reach heaven. The flames are real. The suffering is painful. You stay there until you have paid off what you owe. Relatives pray for you to shorten your sentence. That version of the doctrine is so widely held, so completely assumed, that pointing out how much of it appears nowhere in the Catechism feels almost rude. Open the Catechism of the Catholic Church to paragraphs 1030 through 1032, which are the 3 paragraphs the Church's official teaching actually dedicates to this subject, and read them carefully rather than from memory. Paragraph 1030 says that all who die in God's grace and friendship, but still imperfectly purified, are indeed assured of their eternal salvation, but after death undergo purification so as to achieve the holiness necessary to enter the joy of heaven. Paragraph 1031 calls this the final purification of the elect and specifies that it is entirely different from the punishment of the damned. Paragraph 1032 grounds the whole thing in the practice of prayer for the dead, going back through the Church Fathers and through the second book of Maccabees. 3 paragraphs. That is the complete doctrinal statement. Now compare what is actually in those paragraphs to what most Catholics assume is there. The Catechism describes purgatory as a purification, not a punishment. It describes those in that state as the elect, which means people who are already, unconditionally, saved. It never specifies fire as anything other than a figure of speech cited from earlier tradition. It does not specify duration, intensity, location, or what the experience of purification actually feels like from the inside. It does not say anything about a debt being paid off proportionally. Every one of those details, the fire, the suffering framed as punishment, the length of time serving as a kind of sentence, comes from somewhere other than the 3 paragraphs the Catechism devotes to the subject, layered on top by centuries of theological speculation, popular art, indulgence mathematics, and medieval literature that the Church never formally defined as doctrine. This is not a minor distinction. The official teaching makes a claim about the final destination of a person who is already in God's grace, not about the mechanics of a penal system. The Catechism states plainly that these people are assured of their eternal salvation before describing the purification they undergo. That sequence, salvation confirmed first, purification following as a consequence, is the opposite of how most people think about it, where the purification must be completed before salvation can be considered settled. The Council of Trent in 1563, the most authoritative historical source for the modern doctrine, was equally careful to instruct preachers to avoid, in its own language, uncertain questions and those which have no utility, and to forbid anything that may minister to curiosity or superstition when addressing the faithful on this subject. The council that defined the doctrine also explicitly told preachers not to fill it in with specifics the doctrine itself did not claim to know. If the gap between what 3 paragraphs of official doctrine actually say and what several centuries of popular imagination have built on top of them is a subject you want to explore with primary sources in hand, Reconquest's course on purgatory traces exactly that arc. The link is in the comments. Where did the popular version come from, then? Not from nowhere. The image of purifying fire has deep patristic roots. Gregory the Great in the 6th century described a cleansing fire in some of his homilies, drawing on the language of 1 Corinthians 3 and certain sayings attributed to Jesus in Matthew. The medieval theological tradition built on this extensively, with scholastic writers like Thomas Aquinas working out detailed systematic treatments of temporal punishment, satisfaction, and the precise mechanisms by which prayer and indulgences affected souls in what they called the third place. Dante gave all of this its most famous artistic form in the early 14th century, and his Purgatorio, which is an elaborate mountain with 7 terraces corresponding to 7 deadly sins, each with its own appropriate purgation, passed into cultural memory so completely that many people's mental image of purgatory is, at some level, Dante's invention rather than the Church's definition. Dante was not writing dogma. He was writing poetry. The Church never canonized his geography. The indulgence system added another layer of popular concreteness. The idea that a plenary indulgence could reduce a specific amount of time in purgatory for a specific soul lent the doctrine a transactional quality that made it feel more legible than the bare statements of Florence or Trent actually warranted. The Protestant reformers, attacking what they considered to be a doctrine invented to generate revenue through prayers and masses for the dead, targeted this popular version rather than the restrained official statements, and the Counter-Reformation response, while defending the doctrine, never quite succeeded in stripping it back to the careful limits of the Catechism language, because popular piety had its own momentum. If a grandmother in your family kept a small photo of a deceased relative on the mantle and prayed for them every night without ever having read a word of the councils of Florence or Trent, that practice is itself closer to the oldest layer of the tradition than the architectural systems built on top of it, and it is worth pausing on that for a moment. What the Catechism actually claims, stripped of the accretion, is something considerably more modest and in some ways more remarkable than the popular version. It says that people who loved God imperfectly, which is all of them, are not refused heaven on that account. They are prepared for it. The preparation is called purification rather than punishment specifically because the destination is already certain. And the living can participate in that preparation through prayer, which is why the practice of praying for the dead has existed continuously in every branch of Christianity that still holds to the doctrine, not as a transaction with a fixed rate of exchange, but as an act of love between the living and the dead that the Church treats as genuinely meaningful rather than merely symbolic. Understanding the exact line between what the Church has defined, what theological tradition has proposed, and what popular imagination has simply assumed is exactly the kind of clarity Reconquest's course on Purgatory is built to provide, starting from the primary sources rather than from inherited assumptions. The link to it is waiting in the comments below. That gap, between the 3 spare paragraphs in the Catechism and the vivid architecture most Catholics grew up imagining, is not a gap between truth and error. It is a gap between a deliberately restrained doctrinal statement and centuries of attempts to fill in what that statement leaves open. The Church chose the restraint deliberately. The Council of Trent said so in plain language at the time. What remains after all the centuries of imagination are stripped away is still a real claim, that love is not ended by death, that imperfect people are not excluded from a perfect God, and that what happens in the space between is described officially as a purification towards something, not a punishment for something. That is a considerably different picture than the one most people carry, and it has been sitting in paragraphs 1030 through 1032 the entire time.